You Cannot Blow Up Social Relations, A Critique of Armed Struggle by Christoph Fringeli. Section 1. In this short critical talk, I will briefly outline a view of particular strains of the communist movement of the 20th century, and in particular, the guerrilla movements purporting to be communist and their historical role. Central to my argument is the transformation of Marxism as a critical method and communism as a movement into an ideology of so-called Marxism-Leninism. Therefore, this is not a critique of revolutionary violence as such, but of revolutionary violence's particular manifestation in the form of traditional Marxist-Leninist guerrilla movements, both of the rural and urban types. The topics of other talks are mostly concerned with the situation in Colombia, and one will find specifics about the Colombian situation and in this context, the FARC, strangely absent from my text. What I try to do is to set a historical and ideological context. I'm sure there are people here who know more about the FARC than I do, and I'm more than happy to engage in a discussion after my talk. In the introductory essay to the German edition of Mao Zedong's Selected Military Writings, published as Theorie des Guerillakrieges oder Strategie der Dritten Welt, in 1966 by the publicist Sebastian Hoffner, we can read, quote, "The military writings of Mao Zedong belong to the key books of this century. They are the work of an extraordinary mind, and every reader feels after just a few pages, the particular electrifying effect that the direct contact with the genius invariably produces." End quote. Even though Mao has certainly not invented guerrilla warfare, he was widely seen as guerrilla warfare's most important theoretician in the left. Not only that, as the first sentence in the foreword to the second edition of the famous Little Red Book says, quote, "Comrade Mao Zedong is the greatest Marxist-Leninist of our times," end quote. This book, of which hundreds of thousands of copies were printed, contains hundreds of often banal and stupid quotes such as, quote, "If there is no people's army, there is nothing for the people," end quote. The traditional Maoist line, based on 25 years of the Chinese Civil War, is that the guerrilla operates from the countryside until it is strong enough to finally encircle the cities to eventually take power in a final showdown with the enemy. And these concepts are adapted and modified in different areas of the world. The most iconic and well-known exponent of Latin American guerrilla warfare is Ernesto Guevara. Central to the victorious Cuban Revolution, later Minister for Economy of the new state, Guevara is most famous for trying to export this revolution to the rest of Latin America, and his abysmal failure to do so in Bolivia in 1967, which ended with his capture and extrajudicial execution. This was based on a concept called focus theory, expounded by Ernesto Guevara and his close ally Regis Debray, to justify the strategy of building small military groups in the countryside, which would eventually multiply and grow to sizable armies and be able to control whole areas. The Brazilian Carlos Marighella developed a theory countering this wisdom to concentrate on the cities themselves. His Handbook of the Urban Guerrilla would prove influential for a number of Marxist-Leninist movements in the following years. 10 days after Guevara's death, based in Havana at the time, Marighella wrote his first text, where he shifted the attention from the remote countryside to the urban centers. He wanted to pick up Guevara's torch, but with a new strategy to replace the focus theory, which had proven disastrous in the case of the Bolivian adventure. Secretly, Marighella traveled back to Brazil and started organizing the guerrilla. In September 1968, there was a sharp increase of armed actions such as bank robberies, attacks on military bridges, military buildings, barracks, and so-called, quote, agents of American imperialism, end quote. In the course of the next year, 100 banks were successfully robbed. The insurrection was spreading, also attracting dissident elements from the military. There were assassinations and kidnappings. A climate for revolutionary war was supposed to be created, making traditional political fields of action obsolete. Those refusing to join this adventure were branded, quote, opportunists. After 2 Dominican monks, who were part of the guerrilla, were arrested, the network around the leader broke down, and Marighella was lured into a trap by the police and killed. Marighella's Handbook of the Urban Guerrilla dealt with issues ranging from the organization of the clandestine groups to the character of the urban guerrilla, from bank robberies to executions, technical instructions to weapons, and issues of mobility and logistics. All this has a lot to do with military theory, but nothing with communism. Section 2. Reading contemporary literature about these issues show remarkable confusion. About the Cuban Revolution, Leo Huberman / Paul Sweezy wrote in 1960, quote, that it could historically prove to be one of the most important facts about the Cuban Revolution, that for the first time a genuinely socialist revolution was done by non-communists, end quote. This is an obviously ridiculous assertion, but no more ridiculous than the claim that countries like the USSR, the People's Republic of China, North Vietnam, the Eastern Bloc were communist, whether it was a revolution or an occupation, as in the case of Eastern Europe, that had turned them supposedly so. In none of these countries, social relations were approaching anything remotely similar to the free association, in none of these countries, social relations were approaching anything remotely similar to the free association that Marx and Engels talked about. Modes of production remained intact. There was wage labor, money, commodities, etc. Another quote from Huberman and Sweezy, which seems typical to me for apologists of Leninism in the New Left, quote, the international revolutionary movement in the time between the 2 world wars was dominated by the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state. The success in the largest country of the world gave Lenin and the Bolshevik Party a reputation and authority without competition or example. Wherever there lived revolutionary socialists, there formed identically structured parties and sought to follow to the footsteps of their Russian comrades. For this purpose, they congregated for the foundation of the Communist or Third International, which was planned as a kind of general command of the world revolution, and had the means of power to give its members orders and to implement them. From the beginning, and for the whole duration of its existence, 1919 to 1943, it was de facto controlled by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which thus became the highest political and doctrinal authority of the worldwide communist movement. No party could be considered as communist without approval of the International. No human could be considered a communist unless he belonged to such a party. This institutional and ideological frame was so powerful that it was impossible for a revolutionary to work outside of it. End quote. Huberman and Sweezy. There are a number of mystifications in this text, but perhaps unconsciously, it also shows much of the tragedy of the revolutionary movement of the 20th century. Of course, the Bolsheviks indeed had a massive reputation at the beginning that radiated even beyond the communist circles. However, there were discussions very early on about what kind of influence the Russian party should have in the international, and if the parties in other countries should be constructed just like the Russian one. More importantly, there were soon discussions about the nature of the Soviet Union. Already before Stalin took power in the Soviet Union, there were voices that regarded the country as state capitalist because it failed to abolish the capitalist social relations of wage labor and commodity production. After the mid-20s and the takeover of Stalin, a new ruling stratum solidified in the Soviet Union, and no one not blinded by the propaganda could claim that there was proletarian rule through the workers' councils. When the Trotskyists were trying to save the Leninist heritage against Stalin, the Trotskyists came up with the theory of the, quote, degenerated workers' state. In my opinion, this slightly bizarre idea has its roots more in politics than in actual theory. The story goes that the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky made a proletarian revolution and created the first socialist state, which was perverted by Stalin's theory of, quote, socialism in one country, and therefore degenerated. But since it had gone some steps in the direction of socialism, Trotskyists were supposed to defend the Soviet Union against, quote, imperialism. This is particularly bizarre considering the Russians were at the time engaging in a campaign ranging from disinformation to assassinations against Trotskyists. One can only assume that having invested so much and buying so deep into Leninism, that the Fourth International was prepared to sanction this suicidal analysis, in quotes. Quote analysis. There are still some Trotskyist groups that demand solidarity with states such as Vietnam or North Korea, despite the fact that if there are any, their comrades are more than likely to be languishing in labor camps or as imperialist agents. Sorry, let me repeat that sentence because the quotation's weird. There are still some Trotskyist groups that demand solidarity with states such as Vietnam or North Korea, despite the fact that if there are any, their comrades are more than likely to be languishing in labor camps as, quote, imperialist agents. Of course, the more intelligent people in the movement, like Max Schachmann, or I can't pronounce his name, Schachmann, or the French group Socialisme ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism, soon rejected these views and developed into other directions. Let's go back to the claims of Huberman and Sweezy. From the mid-20s onward, the communist parties outside of Russia were being Stalinized. This went along with exclusions and purges. In the example of the KPD, I can briefly sketch this out. Founded by Rosa Luxemburg and others at the end of 1918, the Communist Party of Germany brought together several small groups from the far left and played a prominent role in the revolutionary phase of 1918 to 1923. Luxemburg, who was a sharp critic of authoritarian aspects of the Russian Revolution, was unfortunately murdered in early 1919. In 1920, the KPD split into two parties. The more radical called itself the KAPD, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany. At the same time, there were other communist mass organizations which were rejecting the Bolshevik party form, the Unionen. These ultra-left organizations lost most of their mass support in the following years after the defeat of the revolution and the relative consolidation of the Weimar Republic, but these ultra-left organizations still existed, and remained a thorn in the side of the KPD. For example, when the KAPD press exposed the collaboration in secret military maneuvers between the Reichswehr and the Red Army. In the meantime, there were power struggles within the party between various factions, the far left of Fischer and Maslow, the so-called right of Brandler and Thalheimer. To make the long story short, all these people were excluded and kicked out by about 1928. This included most of the previous leadership of the party and its leading intellectuals. I think one can say that the KPD was purged of its intelligence by 1930, when they issued the treacherous programmatic text for the national and social liberation of the German people, trying to compete with the Nazi Party on the terrain of nationalist rhetoric. But what did all these people do? Of course, they didn't stop being active as communists. Some founded other parties and groups, such as Karl Korsch's Entscheidende Linke, Lenin Bund, KPO, Brandler and Thalheimer, SAPD, Fritz Sternberg et al., some of which had thousands of members. Others who felt they needed to work within a mass party joined the SPD and tried to work within its structures, for example, Paul Levi and Karl Schroeder. Others worked as publicists with journals or in the context of institutions like the Institute for Social Research. The point I'm trying to make, contrary to the claim of Huberman and Sweezy, it was very possible to work outside the Communist Party as revolutionaries. But there was a difference. The KPD was a mass party that was well funded and offered an institutional structure that many side organizations with many the KPD was a mass party that was well funded and offered an institutional structure with many side organizations with jobs and careers. This isn't enough to explain what followed in the next decade, where Stalinism managed to create a hegemony over what went under the name communism and damaged its reputation almost beyond repair. Despite the fact that the terror that unfolded in the 30s was directed against the communists in the Soviet Union, and the counter-revolutionary role the Stalinists played in the Spanish Civil War, Stalinism, aided by the situation unfolding with World War II, managed to consolidate itself as the prime force on the left. After purging the organization of its most able intellectuals, they found ways to involve, quote, independent writers, artists, etc., like Guide, Brecht, and later Sartre, and many others to do their bidding. By this time, the price for those who worked outside of these structures was indeed a kind of marginalization that made it difficult to have much impact besides the work of theoretical clarification. This situation was a consequence of the fact that the movement had been decimated both by the Nazis and the Stalinists, and that an anticipated revolutionary situation failed to materialize at the end of World War II. Section 3. As Guevara said in a famous dictum, quote, "The duty of the revolutionary is to make the revolution," end quote. But what kind of revolution? In left communist circles, as early as the 1920s, even the nature of the Bolshevik Revolution was debated. Was the Bolshevik Revolution really a proletarian revolution, or in fact a bourgeois revolution performed by a proletarian party? This question is important if we historicize the communist movement, and I think the answer that we can give with the benefit of hindsight is that where successful, so-called communist regimes, under the ideology of Marxism-Leninism, are actually pre-capitalist regimes, the ruling stratum of the bureaucracy taking the role of an absent or weak bourgeoisie to modernize the country and by violently developing the productive forces, making it ready for capitalism. They were in the case of the Soviet Union and are the case in China, transitional societies, not on the way to communism, but to capitalism. Like Lauren Goldner, I think, he does call the revolutions that happened in the 20th century, or at least most of them, bourgeois revolutions with red flags. And there's a recent book came out called from, I think his name's Ralph Ruckus, called The Communist Road to Capitalism, about China's communist revolution paving the way to capitalist development. Anyway. In different times and places, this has different dynamics. A good contemporary example is the situation in Nepal, where Maoists waged years of a people's war, end quotes, against the monarchy. In the end, their leader, Prachanda, became prime minister. One of the first things Prachanda did was speak to foreign investors, reassuring them that their investments were safe with the Maoists in power. Another clear example of Marxist-Leninist making a bourgeois revolution, at best. Waging such a, quote, people's war costs a lot of money. This is all the more true for the traditional rural kind of guerrilla, with armies consisting of tens of thousands of fighters and in control of defined territories. People have to be fed, and even if this is possible from the land, still arms and ammunition, vehicles and technology have to be acquired. In the absence of powerful sponsors, the guerrilla has to turn to expropriation, or bank robberies, kidnapping, and extortion, involvement in illegal business such as the drug trade, and other means to finance itself. These, quote, means to an end can easily become a full-time occupation. Combined with the mass forced recruitment of child soldiers, a dubious internal justice system, and a strong hierarchy, we should definitely be weary of the kind of regime such an organization would impose on the whole country or society after its victory. But even if no territory is to be economically maintained, the guerrilla often becomes so self-concerned that it continues the war mainly for its self-preservation. Such was the case in the confrontation between the German Red Army faction and the state after the, quote, first generation was arrested in 1972. After this, for several years, the main objective of the second generation was to liberate the prisoners. Initially, the RAF had a concept of networks of activists who should be working both in legal initiatives and illegally in the armed underground. In its first declaration, they declare who they do not see as their constituency. Quote, the idle talkers, those who shit their pants, the know-it-alls, end quote. In short, exactly the intellectual left out of which most of the members of the early RAF were coming. Instead, they imagined the workers of Siemens, AEG, and Osram, the proletarian youth, apprentices, school kids, and young people from borstals and institutions to be their audience. In an apparent attempt to reach out to them, and not to sound too intellectual, they end several paragraphs of their short text with the words, damn it. But the RAF also saw themselves always as allies of the national liberation movements of the Third World. Far from being optimistic about the revolutionary potential of the German proletariat in their first text, quote, concept of urban guerrilla, they soon defined themselves almost exclusively as a part of the, quote, anti-imperialist movement. What this means in the final consequence is elucidated by the assessment of the massacre of the Israeli team at the Munich Olympic Games in 1972 by a Palestinian commando, which is celebrated as, quote, anti-imperialist, internationalist, and anti-fascist, end quote. To call a massacre of Jews on German soil an anti-fascist deed is quite something, and one can say the ideological decline of the RAF had reached its lowest point. Years of virtual theoretical silence followed, in a time with a large number of actions were performed, increasingly obsessed with only one goal, to free the prisoners. Like often in the history of guerrilla movements, the state and the guerrilla started escalating each other's agenda, eroding the space for oppositional activities of others in the friction. The guerrilla's increasing violence gives the state every pretext to clamp down on revolutionaries who have nothing to do with the guerrilla. While the guerrilla is blackmailing the revolutionary movement with its, quote, you're either with us or against us, quote, or entweder Schwein oder Mensch in the language of the RAF, either pig or human being. The conflict takes on its own dynamic that leads directly to the state of emergency, as it happened in the autumn of 1977 in Germany, where democracy was effectively suspended for a few weeks. But was it already fascism that the RAF and the other far-left groups, especially of the Maoist kind, had seen on the rise in the 70s? A coming fascism that the RAF indeed used to justify their armed campaign. This is, of course, used to appeal to a certain consensus, that the use of arms would be supported against a fascist regime. But what kind of a regime is fascist? Unfortunately, we also find the bad legacy of Stalinism, where the fascism theory of Georgy Dimitrov comes in. Dimitrov was at the head of the Stalinized Comintern and defined fascism as the most extreme form of bourgeois class rule, a, quote, open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, chauvinistic, most imperialist elements of finance capital, end quote. This idea had a strong influence on the view of fascism even in the post-war years and led to many false conceptions. There are a number of blatant flaws in that one sentence alone. Fascism saw itself as a nationalist revolutionary movement, and cannot be called reactionary in the sense that monarchist or traditional conservatives were in the 1920s. Fascism saw itself as anti-imperialist, challenging the world powers Britain and the US, and it was even less true that fascism was a dictatorship of finance capital. In fact, the Nazis expounded a false kind of anti-capitalism that is at the core of their ideology, supposedly good German productive capital versus, quote, bad Jewish, quote, speculative capital. The key element of anti-Semitism doesn't even enter the Stalinist definition of fascism or National Socialism. Fascism cannot be understood properly if fascism is seen purely as a manipulation by the ruling class, not also as an anti-capitalist mass movement. And fascism cannot be understood properly if fascism is seen purely as a manipulation by the ruling class, and not also as an anti-capitalist mass movement that wants to abolish the classes in a nationalist and racialist framework of the Volksgemeinschaft. The state of emergency, or the rule by decree, as it was practiced from 1930 in Germany, was not fascist rule yet, as the KPD failed to understand, and as a consequence failed to prepare for the actual National Socialist takeover. Equally, the state of emergency in 1977 was not fascist yet. Although the mobs that demonstrated for the reintroduction of the death penalty for the quote, terrorists showed that some potential for such a mobilization was there, a potential that is indeed latent in bourgeois democracy. Dictatorships and mixed forms of dictatorship and democracy are not necessarily fascist, and I think it's important to be precise in analysis in order to find the right ways of fighting them. To return to the guerrilla. I don't know if RAF co-founder Horst Mahler ever thought that he would take power in any way, and maybe end up in a world government alongside Pol Pot and Yasser Arafat. But I guess it's unlikely. With most traditional guerrilla movements, this is different. From Mao and Tito to Castro, the IRA, or Prachanda, and the objective was to take power through military means. The high level of discipline, specialization, and hierarchy in the army makes it unlikely, if not impossible, to have an outcome that leads to universal emancipation and free association. The goal of communism is to abolish reification into separate realms such as work and play, the aesthetic and the political. Or as Marx put it, the human in free association should be able to be a hunter in the morning, a fisher in the afternoon, and a critical critic in the evening. The man who already said this was not a Marxist. The man who already said he was not a Marxist would, I'm pretty sure, have recognized Marxism-Leninism as a major anti-communist force of the 20th century.